Maybe.
Hello, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Great. I just wanted to say welcome, everyone. Welcome to our 9th season of EDTalks and our first ever virtual EDTalks event. I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Adia Morris, and I'm really excited to be returning as the MC for this event. I use she and her pronouns. We're coming to you virtually from the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, or Minnesota-Makoche. This is the homeland of the Dakota people. It's important for us to recognize that unless we're Indigenous Dakota, we're on stolen land, taken through an unauthorized and illegitimate treaty in 1805. We recognize the acts of genocide committed against Native people, and most importantly, we acknowledge that Indigenous people are still here and present all around us. As we focus tonight's conversation on equity in education, I ask that you keep the troubled history of our state in your hearts and minds. So this year we're dedicating our season to elevating Black and Brown voices in the K-12 education, equity, and youth development spaces. Super exciting to hear. Tonight you'll hear from two speakers who are focusing on how we can address misperceptions and reshape our systems to best support Black youth. So just a few housekeeping tips before we start. I want to take a moment to thank our generous sponsors, the Bush Foundation and Comcast. We're so grateful for their continued support, which makes EdTalks possible and allows us to have these important conversations with our community. Both talks have been pre-recorded for this event to ensure our technology works smoothly tonight. However, our presenters are also online with us to participate in a live Q&A at the end of the program. So if you have questions that you want to throw in the Q&A, please type it in the Q&A field. You can see that at the bottom of your window. There's a little button that says Q&A. You can do that at any time, but questions won't be addressed until the end of both presentations. So we're scheduled to conclude at 8 p.m., but our speakers are willing to hang on a bit longer if we need more time to get to more questions. So we encourage you to engage with social media during and after the event. Please use the hashtag EdTalksMN. Also, this event is being recorded for our EdTalks video and audio libraries, which you find by visiting the EdTalks webpage at achieveminneapolis.org/EdTalks. So without any further ado, let's get started. Our first speaker comes to us from the Office of Black Student Achievement at Minneapolis Public Schools. Michael Walker is a highly experienced leader in youth development and assisting Black youth to achieve success. As the inaugural director for the Office of Black Male Student Achievement, now the Office for Black Student Achievement, he works to expand support and change outcomes for Black students in Minneapolis Public Schools. Michael is former assistant principal and dean of students at Roosevelt High School, has served as a career and college center coordinator for Achieve Minneapolis, and directed the Black Achievers program at the YMCA of Minneapolis and Greater St. Paul, where he managed programs focusing on social, academic, athletic, and employment skills for youth. A graduate of Minneapolis Public Schools, he holds a master's degree in counseling from the University of River Falls, Wisconsin. Thank you, University of Wisconsin, River Falls. Thank you so much for being here, Michael. So let's kick us off.
Well, thank you, Adia, for that great introduction. I'm excited to be here tonight to share with you my topic and my talk around changing outcomes for Black males. Again, I'm Michael Walker. I'm director currently for the Office of Black Student Achievement in Minneapolis Public Schools, which started off as the Office of Black Male Student Achievement. And so we're going to focus tonight on changing outcomes for Black males. So first, I would like for you to take a look at this image here. And it says, "What do you see?" And the thing is, what do we see when we view our Black males within our school system, but within our broader society? What are the biases that show up when we connect with them, when we see them walking down the street, when we see them sitting in the classroom? What are those biases, right? What are we seeing? What is the stereotypes that come to the forefront of our minds? And we have to know that those stereotypes are there because we see the outcomes that are happening within our school system. We know the desperate numbers that are going on in our academic system, in our educational world. And so we want to be mindful that I'm being mindful tonight to not share those numbers because we know what those numbers are. And I don't want to send out messages of deficit thinking around our Black males. But I want us to know that we have to change those outcomes if we really want to change outcomes for Black males. So I want you to think about that when you see this image. What do you see? What do you think about? So I'm going to talk about a statement that Malcolm X said, one of my most favorite people of all time. He says, "I, for one, believe that if you give people a thorough understanding of what confronts them and the basic causes that produces it, they will create their own program. And when the people create a program, you will get action. And I would add that you will get results." Right? And so as we started out on this journey, as I started on this journey around how to change outcomes for Black males, it was real important that I got the voice of the young Black men to be part of this process. Right? Too often we have communities, organizations, school systems creating initiatives, creating outcomes without having the voice of the people at the table. And I want to make sure that we have the voice of these young men at the table while we're deciding on what their future should be. They should have a say and a stake in that. And so that's one of the first things that we can do is uplifting that voice, valuing that voice, validating that voice, allowing that voice to be within our spaces, right? And ensuring that once we hear that voice and that perspective, now let's do something with that information and not just have it, right? Not just have them speaking it and then we don't do anything with it. We have to make sure that we're utilizing that information so that they can see that we are actually changing what we're doing in our practices for the betterment of them. And so what I did with that information is I basically went on this 100 days of listening, right? I went on 100 days of listening to hear the voices of our black males. And I went out and listened to parents and families, community members, educators. But again, I'm gonna keep saying, more importantly, I listened to black males. But when I was listening to these different 4 stakeholder groups, what did I hear? I heard a lot of broken beliefs, right? There's a system of broken beliefs that we are experiencing as black men in this country. Right, and we're going to go specific to the school system. What we found out, or what I found out during this research, is that the broken beliefs that parents had was that they didn't feel that the educational system was fair and equitable when it came to dealings with their black male students. And I have to look at the data and say they have a right to say that, right? The community, they didn't believe that the educational systems were serving all students. When we look at our data, again, we start seeing all these numbers that are not looking well for other groups, not just our black students, but other minoritized and marginalized groups are also impacted by this educational system. And then when I talked to educators, they had some beliefs around they didn't have the tools necessary to support black males in the classroom. And so that was something that we wanted to listen to, and I saw that broken belief that they didn't believe they had the tools necessary to support. And then when I spoke and listened to the young black men, they didn't believe that the school system was there for them, that they didn't have true, authentic relationships with educators, that they didn't get to learn and understand about who they were as people. The curriculum just wasn't designed with them in mind. And so that was a system, a broken belief system that we noticed and recognized within our school system. So from those broken beliefs, I decided to create this framework, and it's called the Belief Framework. And what this is really signifying is that how do we as adults, what are our beliefs? Because our beliefs will dictate how we treat and what we expect out of our black males. And so this belief frameworks have 4 components. It centers parents and families, it centers community members, it centers educators, as well as black males. And what we want to do is change those broken beliefs to positive beliefs, right? So we want our parents and families to believe that the educational system is fair and equitable when it comes to dealings with their black male students. We want the community to believe that our system of education is serving all students. We want to make sure that educators feel that they have the tools necessary to support black males in their educational journey. And then we want our black males to see academic success in their future. And so we want to make sure that they know that the curriculum is designed with them in mind. We want to ensure that they see people that look like them within the school system, right? Because we have to be sure that we as adults are changing our beliefs and our mindsets, because that will dictate what our outcomes are. And that is very important for us to understand as we talk about this belief framework. And as we talk about the belief framework, right, it's something that comes to my mind all the time is that why have we been trying to solve a non-academic issue with academic solutions? And I say that because, or I ask that question because when I went out and did my 100 days of listening, the young black men told me abundance of things that they were successful in, that they were great in, that they were doing well in. It just so happened that we wasn't seeing that same outcome within the school system, right? And so it made me understand that it's not about the black males, it's about the system as a whole, right? Our work, our job is not to fix black males. And I know sometimes when you hear about an office specifically designed for a specific population, we may get to the thoughts, well, that office is supposed to do that, or that department is supposed to work in that manner. No, this is not about fixing black males. We have to fix the systems that black males have to engage within, and that is about adults. So how do we start to change our thoughts, our beliefs, so that when they engage within a system, it is welcoming, it is inviting, right? So from the belief framework, we created 3 bucket areas that we would like to focus on. One is professional development for educators. The second one is authentically engaging with our families and communities. And the third is direct service with our kings. We want to ensure that we put together a plan that is all encompassing, that is holistic, so that we can hit every different area that our black males are engaging within our school system, right? So providing professional development for educators is really important so we can start to change mindsets and beliefs. Creating and connecting with our communities in an authentic and engaging way is really important because we have to realize that our families may have experienced an educational trauma that we don't necessarily talk about, right? The data that we are seeing now, that we have seen for years, is not new. So we have to realize that some of our black families have experienced this educational system in the same way. And so we have to rebuild, regain that trust. And the way we do that is getting outside of our spaces, getting outside of our buildings and listening to that voice, bringing that voice to the table and allowing it to lead us as we educate their students. Right? And then the last one I said is direct service with our kings. And this is where we created a class, and the class is called Black. It stands for Building Lives, Acquiring Cultural Knowledge. And this class is really based in who am I, right? Who are we? What is our current state? Where am I going and how do I get there? So these are the 5 questions that we would like for our young kings to be able to answer once they complete our program. When we think about the classroom, right, I was very intentional about hiring black men because we know there's a dearth of black male educators within our system. And so as I said from our 100 days of listening, we heard from our students that they didn't see people that looked like them in our spaces. And so I was intentional about hiring black men to come into the classroom to teach this class, and not only for the benefit of black males, but the benefit of other students as well. We have to realize that we may be creating biases in our students' minds by the positions that we have our staff in. So if we have black men as teachers, now our white students, our Latinx students, our indigenous students, our Asian students, they see black men as educators. And so when they have opportunities to hire black men as educators, it may change the outcomes of how many educators we have. The other thing that we can do, which is very simple, is we have the ability to recruit students from pre-K to 12th grade. How many of us have went to a black male and said, hey, you would be a really good teacher? How many of us have done that? If we can do those small things, we can maybe change the outcomes of who is teaching in our classrooms. Because we know the research that talks about if one student has a black male teacher, the likelihood of them dropping out decreases. And so how can we be more mindful of doing that? Within this classroom that we have designed, this black class with these teachers that are black, that look like our students, that is designing this curriculum. What I went out and did was researched and looked for black men from the community that had a strong ability to build relationships. What I know about the educational world is that we have teachers that are really good at their content, very good. We go to classes, we have schools, all those things teach us how to deliver our content. But what is missing sometimes in those programs is how to build relationships, right? And so now we have educators who are standing in front of our students that are lacking that relationship, that haven't put the time in to build that relationship. And so what I focus on in our department and our work is saying, hey, our first 4 things are going to be relationship building, and then we'll get to that curriculum. And so we and I have coined this term called relational instruction. Right? How do we have this relational instruction that we can deliver with our students? Because we know that absent a relationship, it's hard to teach anybody anything. But present a relationship, I can teach you whatever I need to teach you, and you're willing to listen, right? And we think about this when we talk about like coaching and athletes, right? You will know players and athletes that will run through brick walls for their coaches. But that's because they have built that relationship. They took that time to build that relationship. That's what we should be doing in a classroom. Sometimes we're jumping right to the academics and forgetting about the customers, the young people that are sitting in front of us that want to be connected, that want to feel loved, that want to feel like they are valued, right? And so we have a workshop that I deliver called Becoming an Aunt and Uncle in the Classroom. And it's really about how do I see these young black men as my nephews? Because if I see them as my nephews, the likelihood of me sending them out of the classroom decreases. The likelihood of me not challenging them on academics decreases. And so we want to make sure that we see them as family, because now we are creating that family in our classroom and in our space, and now we're talking about how we are a collectivist environment, right? Academics and education should be around a collectivist mind frame. How do we support each other? How are we learning and growing from each other? And that is very important. And that is what relational instruction is all about. Building that relationship first and then delivering the content second. And we will see some of these outcomes change for Black males. I want you to do this thing with me really quick. If you could close your eyes for a second and just listen to a couple stories. So we have Robert, who's a third grade student, and he is very excited about school, eager. He's reading at a fourth grade reading level. He is part of the band team at the school. He's enjoying his academic career. Third grader, Robert. Then we have a seventh grader by the name of Marcus, right? Seventh grade student. He's already taken a advanced biology course, science course in middle school. He is advanced in math. He's part of the student council and just enjoying school. Another Black male in seventh grade doing outstanding work. And then we have Sean, senior in high school, who's already taken 12 credits of PSEO, who is the president of his student council team or his senior class, who's also a athlete and is planning on attending a HBCU college university, right? I want you to open your eyes now. That is the outcomes that we want to see for our Black males. That is what we deem success. And as I end with this statement, this is why we exist, to awaken a greatness within Black males, to have them determined to believe and achieve success as defined by their own values and dreams. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. One of the things I wish you could see was that my head was about to fall off. I was nodding so hard. I so appreciate that talk. This is a reminder to everyone, submit your questions through the Q&A box as they come to you. We'll get to as many as we can at the end of the program. So next we'll hear from Dr. Artika Tyner with her talk, Learn to Read, Learn to Lead. Dr. Artika R. Tyner is a passionate educator, author, and advocate for justice. A professor at the University of St. Thomas School of Law, she is founding director at the school's Center on Race, Leadership, and Social Justice, where she trains students to serve as social engineers and create new inroads to justice and freedom. Artika also provides leadership development coaching and resources for young people and adults, organizes policy campaigns, fosters restorative justice practices, develops social entrepreneurship initiatives, and promotes asset-based community development. The founder of Planting People, Growing Justice, she has been featured in a variety of media outlets and has received over 24 awards for her leadership and service from the American Bar Association and several other organizations. Dr. Tyner, take it away.
Well, thank you, Adia, for that great introduction.
Okay, thank you, Adia, for the warm introduction. My mantra as a teacher is, we see a problem, we create a solution. What that really means for me is training the next generation of leaders, preparing them to use their critical thinking skills, their analytical skills to make an impact in the community. So when I think about that and I open my lecture with, we see a problem, we create a solution, it's really about a leadership challenge. And when I'm talking about leadership, I'm not referring to a position or a title. I'm really talking about our ability to use our influence to make a difference and make an impact in the community and world around us. And there's no time like the present, with so many pressing social justice issues surrounding us in our communities, in our homes, and in our schools. And who's better positioned to do this and take on this role? Teachers and educators. History has shown us that educators have been at the forefront of social change. And when we think about it, they're really serving the role of being lead problem solvers. So when I talk about a lead problem solver and who a lead problem solver is, it's someone who uses their training as a tool to create access to justice. It's someone who eradicates inequities, and as an attorney, I also think about it in this capacity, ensuring equal justice under the law. And we have some trailblazers that we can emulate. For instance, Mary McLeod Bethune, who gave us that mantra around servant leadership, who reminded us for students that they enter the school to learn and leave to serve. We also have Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, who gives us a clear sense about expectations and ensuring that we're inspiring our young people to lead change in the future. He reminds us that the greatest failure of life is related to low aim. So what we have to then provide our young people and provide our students with the aspiration and the expectation that they are the leaders of today, tomorrow, and in the future. And then just in case we look at it as a good metaphor, we also have to think about leading what? What will be the impact of leadership? And I'd like to look to Dr. King for that answer. He reminds us that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. And if you think about that, that sounds nice, but former President Barack Obama takes us a step further. He reminds us that it does not bend on its own. So when we think about leadership, when we think about my mantra, we see a problem, we create a solution, it's really about us being those benders and those leaders. So we first have to ask ourselves, what is the problem that we seek to solve? What's our passion? And when I think about it, it's really asking, what is your leadership story? So I'll tell you a little bit about mine. Who am I? Well, for me, my problem that I'm seeking to solve is ending mass incarceration. And that issue has been a challenge for me ever since I was a child. I was a child witness to the war on drugs. So I saw our moms, our dads, aunts and uncles, neighbor and friends enter into the prison gates for nonviolent drug offenses. But what happened was not just that they returned back home with a permanent scarlet letter that read F for felon. What happened to them was something much bigger, with a myriad of different challenges. They returned back home with restricted access to jobs, to housing, to education, and even voting. If we look at one additional aspect of the challenge, I call this the tangled web of mass incarceration. I gave you just one dimension with the impact of the war on drugs. But also as an educator, I'd be remiss if I did not mention the school-to-prison pipeline. And when we think about this, this is the referrals from the classroom to the courtroom for issues related to school disciplinary matters and also zero-tolerance policies. Let's put it into perspective. On an annual basis, over 3 million children are referred out of the classroom for suspensions. That means that's enough children to fill every NFL stadium combined across the nation. So we know when children are not in the classroom receiving instruction, when they're not in the classroom learning, it also increases their likelihood of future incarceration. So when we look at this, we then see that if we're going to take this into perspective, we need to understand who's impacted and what exactly is mass incarceration. So I described it as a tangled web. So let's get a sense of what that web looks like. America can be considered as the incarceration capital of the world. That's because we have about 5% of the world's population and over 20% of the world's prison population. Coupled with that, 1 in 3 Americans have a criminal record. That's over 70 million people. But here's the piece that we often don't talk about, is a sense that race also matters. But I'll start off by dispelling a myth. When I bring up this data, it's not that African Americans commit crimes at a higher rate. It's also not that we use drugs at a higher rate. These are all myths and stereotypes. It's actually how the system impacts us all the way from policing to sentencing. There's bias throughout. So then what do we see? The research from Michelle Alexander that she talked about in her book, The New Jim Crow, we get a sense then that there are more African American males under the control of the correction system than who were enslaved in the 1800s. And then when we look at children, we see that a black boy born in the early 2000s, has a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison in his lifetime. I think we've become comfortable with sharing that data with each other. But unfortunately for me, I feel a little bit like the late Marvin Gaye. It makes me want to holler. This is unacceptable. We can no longer afford to recite this data without coming up with practical solutions. And I'll tell you what my solution was. As I mentioned earlier, plenty of entry points, far too many, and far fewer exit points out of this system and tangled web of mass incarceration. So instead of just lamenting the problem again, having another conversation, saying, isn't that a shame? I decided to take action. Remember I said we see a problem, we create a solution? I brought my friends together right into my living room, and I started to talk about this data, especially as it relates to literacy. We talked about the sense that many of my clients learned how to read when they were in prison. And when I think about, once again, that is unacceptable, it means that my clients did not understand the cases that were against them. They didn't understand their indictments. They couldn't understand what was happening with the evidence. But it also meant that there was an opportunity that just maybe, if we address some of these literacy gaps, that we would be able to close out one of those entry points into this tangled web. So this is what you need to know. Depending on which study you're looking at, over 60% of the prison population is illiterate. How does that relate to literacy gaps? When 1 in 4 children in America are not reading at grade level by 4th grade, that increases their likelihood of dropping out of school, but it also increases their likelihood of future incarceration by over 3 times, 3.5 times to be exact. So it then begs the question, what can we do? We decided to take action by creating a campaign called the Leaders Are Readers campaign. So remember that group of friends coming together? We sat down and we thought, what could we do to bring forth meaningful change? So with the Leaders Are Readers campaign, the first thing that we did, we decided to publish our own children's book. And for us, that was our first step in promoting literacy. And the book was about a little girl named Justice. And she learns an important lesson, because remember I said as an educator, I'm committed to training the next generation of leaders. She learns a leadership lesson. Her grandmother teaches her, although she's 8 years old, she's never too young to make a difference. That's for all of us. You're never too young, you're never too old to start with where you are. So with starting where you are, she's inspired by heroes and sheroes who decide to pick up that mantle of leadership. So one example is Dr. Wangari Maathai of Kenya. She makes a decision in her fight for environmental justice to plant one seed, to plant a tree. And she talked about how planting trees would plant hope in the community. And you know what happens next. Once you get started, others start to join you. So mothers, daughters, aunties, grandmamas, they all came together and they started planting trees. The impact was what we know today. Her organization is called the Green Belt Movement. And there have been over 50 million trees planted as a part of this movement. So why does this matter as a lesson for young people? It reminds them that it's not where they start, but how they finish. And it also reminds them to take that first step, that first action step, and in becoming a leader, that when they see a problem, they can create solutions as well. It wasn't just enough to deal with this issue about having a book and getting the books in the hands of children. We started to experience another problem that we needed to address. And this was specifically related to promoting diversity in books. So as we looked at the possibility of what we could do, one book wasn't enough. So we started to create a whole collection of racially diverse books. And what we found when we started to look at the data was it was important to create both mirrors and windows for children. So when we think about the importance of books, how can we create an interest in reading when the books don't reflect the people who are reading them? So we're left with a bit of a pondering of a question. How could it be that you're more likely to see a book cover with a main character, protagonist, as a black dog or a black bear versus seeing a black girl or a black boy? Why am I saying that? Because you can look at the data. 27% of books represent an animal on the front for children's book, where only 10% of books represent an African-American main character. We were able to change that with our books as well, based upon that notion that you can't be what you cannot see. So we were able to also help to promote diversity in books in meaningful ways to help increase interest in reading. Very important. Mirrors, so our young black children could see themselves. That's that sense that Lorraine Hansberry talks about, that you're young, gifted, and black. So a sense of empowerment, but also windows across cultures, that we can be able to see into other cultures, appreciate other cultures, while also celebrating our differences in meaningful ways. So this was for all children and for all families. This was inspired by my leadership theory, which is called Planting People, Growing Justice. This emerged as I continued to ask questions. What steps do we need to take to build and sustain social change? How do we bring forth meaningful change in our communities? And more importantly, who is going to lead that charge? And guess what? That's you and I. So you may be wondering, what is Planting People, Growing Justice? Planting People has been inspired by the image of the banyan tree. And what makes that tree unique? I had a chance to see it when I was in Hawaii, and I was in awe. It's one of the only trees that grows new roots from its branches. I think that's the perfect image of community, that we're all interconnected and that we're growing intergenerationally on this quest to bring forth our shared destiny and our common vision on what this means to build a more just and inclusive society. So the banyan tree has been the inspiration then for growing justice, of bringing everyday people together and leading their own change, whether it's a fight for environmental justice, as I brought up, related to Dr. Wangari Maathai, or if it's a fight to help to address the needs in the community related to food deserts, whatever it may be. We've been able to use this model to inspire everyday people to have an extraordinary impact in their community. So when we think about this specifically, what can you do as a leader? As you're watching, what do you have to think about? I hope that you take just 3 steps. First, I hope you heard my story of what problem I was seeking to address. I hope that you take a moment to find your passion. Now, I talked about my passion being related to mass incarceration, but my vehicle as a leader to address that issue was becoming a civil rights attorney. And I was inspired to become a civil rights attorney after a trip to South Africa. And when I traveled to South Africa, I learned about this important term that changed my life. It's called Ubuntu. And it's a notion that a person is a person through others. So all of a sudden I had to think more critically of what is my connection to my community? How can I be a change agent? And how can I do this in partnership, an empowerment paradigm with others? So I was inspired by the words of Archbishop Tutu. He reminds us that if we believe in Ubuntu, that we're willing to go the extra mile in everything that we do. So my daily challenge is going the extra mile in criminal justice reform in order to end mass incarceration. Next, we have a challenge to redefine leadership. It's tempting to say you're a leader because you're the adult and you have the position, you have the title. But what's amazed me over the past 14 years as an educator is how my students have led meaningful change. So when I think about this, I think about the essence of servant leadership, that it's really about your conscious efforts on serving and making an impact in the community that should inspire you to lead. And how can we do that? Oh, you're ready for my next leadership challenge. It's by taking action and getting involved. And so for me, of course, I talked about mass incarceration. So here's a few ways that you can get involved. You can join in, follow online on social media, the Free America campaign to support ending mass incarceration. You can support for the school to prison pipeline, more restorative justice practices being used in schools. You can raise awareness. You can talk about campaigns like the Restore the Vote campaign, which seeks to accomplish having those folks who are in our community, paying taxes, being a part of civic engagement, that their right to vote is restored, that their felony conviction and probation or their status in the criminal justice system should not restrict their access to the ballot box. What else can you do? Readers are leaders is the notion of our work. Leaders are readers, so it means you should start reading. Start a book club. Read books like Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson or Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow. So in closing, as I think about how this ties together on my life's journey, I've been reminded as we started the Leaders Are Readers campaign and started to focus on these literacy gaps, that there's no problem too big to solve. That we can, just like a puzzle, take our piece of the puzzle and start to bring it all together collectively. And that's how we'll bring social change. That's how we'll manifest change on some of the large, pressing social justice issues of our time. So the notion that keeps me inspired related to this work, it impacts millions of people's lives, families all across the nation. We can be impactful if we take on that mantra of that old civil rights song, that we are the ones that we've been waiting for.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tyner. Again, I wish you could see and hear me reacting over here. I'm sure my child appreciates it. So this is the opportunity where you all have to put your questions in the Q&A box. And as you think about any questions that you might have, I'm going to invite Dr. Tyner and our first speaker, Michael Walker, to turn on their video and audio and join us so we can see them and they can answer questions as they come in. Hi, Dr. Tyner. Hi, Michael. So good to see you both live. even though I really enjoyed both of your presentations. Nope, I'm not all done. My kid is asking if I'm all done. I'm not all done. So the first question that came in is a question for Mike. It says, maybe they know you. What inspired you to become an educator?
Oh, well, I call myself a non-traditional educator. I really worked in the YMCA for a number of years before getting into education, but it was a teacher who kind of was on me to say, hey, I was coaching basketball and she was one of my old teachers from the high school. And she kept saying, you would be good in education, you would be good in education. And I was really, adamant about not wanting to be a teacher because I felt like I would be like stuck in a classroom the entire time. And so what I ended up doing is going back to get my counseling license, which is how I got into education, is by being a licensed counselor. So that's kind of what got me in there. And the reason why I chose counseling is because I wanted to ensure that I was providing an opportunity for students that looked like me, who didn't necessarily get all the support around looking for college.
Excellent. I'm going to jump to a question for Dr. Tyner. What advice would you give someone struggling to create a solution to a problem they're attempting to solve?
I think it's that advice of bringing people together. Oftentimes we try to work in isolation, but the power from what I gave as my own testimonial, bring some friends together, bring some folks from the community together. And I know with COVID, it may be difficult to meet in person, but you can use Zoom, use social distancing, and just start identifying the issues. And make sure that one important piece, I didn't discuss this in my presentation, but Mr. Walker did very clearly, make sure that it's not just something in the abstract, that is something directly related to something that you're passionate about and the folks that are impacted. I just had to tell one of my mentees about this. Make sure they have a seat at the table. Make sure that they direct the agenda and bring it all together. But it's tempting to say, I'll solve your problem, instead of saying, what is the problem? How are we all impacted? And how do we bring forth meaningful change?
Excellent. I'm going to jump to another question for Mr. Walker. And also maybe if you can, this question is about the Black classroom. And I'm wondering if you, in addition to answering this question, can also talk a little bit about the structure of it as you answer this question. The question is, how can one get involved with Black? Do you have a virtual program? Are you recruiting men and women to help?
Yeah, so I'll answer the question about the structure of Black. So Black is a class that's like students go to. It's like math, science, or social studies. They go to this class, Black. And I want to make sure I say it stands for Building Lives Acquiring Cultural Knowledge. And so it's an everyday class that students attend with a teacher. And so at the moment, we're not recruiting for teachers to come teach that class. However, there's always opportunities for folks to volunteer. One thing that we do in our space is that everyone shares their autobiography. So we share our stories of how we came to be here today. And that starts with the instructor, the classroom coach. And then we have our students also share that story. Because again, one of our key components is trying to build and create a family within that space. And the way you do that is by sharing your stories so we can get to know each other and learn about each other in different ways that are not just based in the classroom.
Excellent. And this is actually kind of related to that, just talking about relationship building. It says, if relationship building is centered, will white women make inroads with our Black youth, or will we start to see more change as we alter the demographics of our teaching workforce?
Well, first I'll say, I hope we see more change in our demographics of teachers. However, the statement about white women, so my favorite teacher, the teacher that I was just talking about earlier, who talked to me about being an educator, was a white woman. She was my favorite teacher in the world. So I definitely think that white women can build these relationships. It does mean that you have to go above and beyond, not just what happens in the classroom. She was very skilled at coming to our events outside of the classroom. So she came to our basketball games, came to our events. She would make sure that she took pictures of us at different events and then showed it to us in classroom, asked us questions about what happened in our game the night before, or things of that nature. But, obviously, as I started to become older and I end up eventually working with her, she told me some tricks of the trade. So it's not like that she stayed at our games for the entire time. She kind of showed up at the very beginning to make sure we saw her so that we could build that relationship and that connection. She had a little trick that she would ask the people in second hour, kind of what did I do the night before in the basketball game, so that she can have some insight to share with me when I came to her class third or fourth hour, right? So just being mindful of how you're being intentional about building those relationships and those connections. So anyone can do it. It's about, do I have the willingness and I want to do it.
Excellent. This question is for Dr. Tyner. What advice would you give to someone looking to write a book?
I think I would say the same advice of connecting it to your passion. Because when I first wrote my children's book, it was something that just flowed from my heart. It's dedicated to my late grandmother, Nellie Lightfoot. So if you pick up the book, Justice Makes a Difference, you see a little likeness. You see Grandma Nellie and myself. That was my Citizen of the Week picture when I was 7 or 8 years old. So you see some connections. So everything that I do, you know, the secret ingredient is that passion and love. So once you have that idea of what it is, what you're passionate about, what message that you want to give, and especially for a children's book, make sure that it relates to your audience. I've also written other textbooks for adults as well, but you want to make sure it's relevant, it's inspirational, it has a clear context. And once again, remember how I talked about the power of community? I joined a Black women's writing circle. And that way we had a community around us and we would read each other's works, offer feedback. And also we had very seasoned writers like the award-winning Carolyn Holbrook. She was a part of the writing circle. So once you brought us all together, you know, we talk about Black girl magic. I can't tell you all that transpired from those Saturday meetings of us coming together, sharing our passion, sharing our vision and story. So once again, get connected.
Excellent. Yeah. I think I know this circle, Dr. Tyner. May have some connection to that lately. For both presenters, how do you keep your motivation going when every day is or can be full of discouraging news and developments related to your work? I don't know who wants to go first. Mr. Walker, maybe.
I'm about to say, Dr. Tyner, you can go first.
Okay.
I'll jump in then. For me, it's definitely rooted in my faith. I mean, I wake up and I try to reflect on how my faith is going to guide my day. For instance, Micah 6:8 tells us to seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before God. So when I think about what's happening before me each day, of course, as you heard my presentation, it's focusing on making justice come alive. And when we talk about justice, oftentimes we just talk about fairness, and there comes a lot of disappointment when we look at the criminal justice system or the world around us. So also maybe adding the component of social justice that looks at the components of the economics of it, the environmental justice pieces, and really looking at how can equity, and in capacity of what we're talking about today, how can equity come alive and be tangible? So for me, I also have to remind myself, I remember I was doing a lecture on National Teachers Day, which welcome and blessings to all the teachers again today as we honor you. But I remember the teachers were all kind of writing their retirement and transfer letters after I got done with my presentation. They said they felt so inspired they were going to choose a new career. I was like, that was not my point. I wanted to inspire you to understand, as we talk about planting seeds, that I may plant a seed that I may not reap the harvest from. Someone else, maybe Mr. Walker will nurture that seed. Maybe Audio will be a part of helping to offer that support to a young person. So I think a part of what we have to do is change our mindset, the way that we're thinking. We think oftentimes being an educator, supporting in the community is transactional, is linear from one person to the next. There are seeds that I planted that I will never live to see. That's the blessing of it all, that it will come to fruition. So I say that just to give you a little encouragement, because when I initially just started off thinking about leadership, I thought about it in that transactional way. But leadership is actually transformational. And especially if you put that power of faith, that human capital with it, and that sense of community. So when I think about that question, it's an ongoing battle. Every moment I have to choose, and I have to remind myself that I'm planting the seed today for a future harvest of justice and freedom.
Yeah, I got to go after that. So no, I would say that what motivates me is that just knowing that that I am making a difference in someone's life, whether it's one person at a time or it's a group of young men or young ladies. But the way I try to stay motivated is taking care of myself. I know that sometimes it's hard to do, especially when you want to be there for your students, you want to be there for families, you want to be there for the community. We have to find moments where we can take care of ourselves and fill our cups up so that we can be better for the young people that we're serving. And so I'm definitely trying to be mindful of that. I'm not saying that I'm good at that right now, but I try my best to do that. We need to make sure that we have people in our corners or in our circle that can help us think through that will tell us to take that time. Because again, if you're doing this work and you're in it for the long haul and it's mission driven, the likelihood of you just stepping away is definitely not high. And so you need people that will be intentional about telling you to step away and take some time for yourself, because we have to do that if we want to stay healthy and ready to serve others. So that's kind of how I try to stay motivated.
Excellent. Here's a question. It's a little bit longer, and I think maybe it's a two-parter. It says, does OBSA, Office of Black Student Achievement, address the systemic influence education has had to create a bias in our children where they initially push back when I discuss social and environmental justice issues in my science class? Because they share with me that social justice issues should only be taught in the Black culture class, a social studies class, or an ethnic studies class. I ask questions, I share the role that science had in the past that promoted racism and is now trying to, my question just jumped, now trying to change that narrative by using science to show how racism affects us emotionally, physically, etc. Students do start to realize that social justice issues and topics, ideas should be discussed and learned and discussed in every class, but it takes time and patience. Does the OBSA teach that social justice and everyone's history should be referenced and taught in every class and present in every educational space? So I think addressing the systemic influence education has had to create bias, and then teaching that social justice and everyone's history should be referenced and taught in every class.
Yeah, so I'm trying to make sure I kind of answer. I think there's a lot of parts in there, but the easy way to say is yes, we definitely push and promote that. One way that we talk about that is how do they take the learning that they're having in the Black class into their other classes and let that knowledge permeate throughout the system. Because what we are providing is sometimes the narratives that have not been shared within our Eurocentric curriculum. And so we're providing an Afrocentric curriculum. And so they have a responsibility to share that information with other students who may not have the privilege of being in our class. Just because of numbers, we are not offering our class at every single school, so not every single student gets that opportunity to be in our space. And so we let them know that they do have a responsibility to share this information, to share this knowledge in other spaces that they go into. And so that's why sometimes you may see some young men that have been part of the Black class will start to question what is happening in their traditional social studies classrooms and saying, so what was going on with Black people during this time? And so they're going to say, what is the other narratives that were happening during that time? And so if teachers are not prepared and ready for that type of questioning, what we inadvertently do to our Black students is that we call it disrespectful, or we call it disobedient or insubordinate. And now we see a high response of being sent out, which is what we've already noticed, being referred out of class or suspended. And so that's why I shared in the talk about our job is not to fix Black boys. It's to fix the system, because we have to do work with the adults. And so we also provide professional development with the adult educators so that they are prepared and ready for these more engaged learners when they are starting to ask questions. I mean, that's what we want. We want inquiry. We want inquiry. But again, we know when Black men starts to challenge or ask questions, the results are not always in our favor. So we have to prepare the adults to be ready to accept that, especially if we're saying that we want to have more engaged learners. Well, we know that engagement is about asking questions and challenging what you're sharing with me. So we want to make sure that that is afforded to all students.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Tyner, a question about the name of the book that you wrote. I'm guessing that this attendee means the children's book. And are you able to share the list of books that you referenced or any recommendations for children's books with diverse characters?
Yes, the name of the book that I reference is Justice Makes a Difference, the story of Miss Freedom Fighter Esquire. That was the first book that we worked on for the Leaders or Readers campaign. Since then, we wrote our second book was Amazing Africa A to Z. We were looking to dispel many of the myths that people had about the continent, which they still call a country in many instances. And then from there, we thought about the early learners. We also wrote a book called Kofi Loves Music that looks at the musical influences of Africa around the world. And our most recent book is Ghana, a place called Home, which helps to celebrate the history of the 2019 year of return, critically examining the narratives around the transatlantic slave trade, and really highlighting some of the heroes and sheroes of the continent. So we've published quite a few books. I only gave you a short list, but in addition to that, if you're looking for diverse books, I encourage you to follow that hashtag, We Need Diverse Books. You can get on their website, follow the hashtag, and find plenty of resources. It's one of the things that I can say, it's not how you start, it's how you finish. With just a few books, the numbers have continued to grow over the past few years.
Excellent. I do remember seeing that graphic and being appalled at the percentages of representation. I do want to ask a follow-up about the Leaders Are Readers campaign, Dr. Tyner. What's happening? What's next for it? What's happening locally, nationally, globally?
I think the big what's next is continuing creating those books with a clear message that representation matters, that training young people related to leadership is essential. And what's next is taking the work. I know we're working locally and doing book drives. We partnered, for instance, with Do Good Roseville for our local community, and we got books into the little free library. So we're doing a lot of work nationally to support those movements right in the community. And I think added to that, once we put the national piece, spreading those book drives and hosting them everywhere that we can, adding the global component is that primarily that our work has been in Ghana. So we look forward to returning next summer to continue with our leadership summits and bringing books to the community that we work at the Sinchi Ferry Library and in the Akwamu Kingdom.
Excellent. Another question for, my child is having some trouble with his video. Another question for Michael that came in early on. This question is for Michael. I come tonight with a slightly different lens working with adult learners. Many of the students we work with come to us as a product of that deficit thinking during their K-12 experience. What would you recommend for adult educators to build similar relationships and high expectations with these learners as adults?
Yeah, I mean, that basically is what our school systems have done, right? I'm sure you guys have heard of Bettina Love's book around spirit murdering. And so if you keep hearing stories and narratives about yourself that are negative, then eventually you could start to fall into that trap of believing those things. And so it's on us as educators to change that narrative and share a different narrative with our students. And again, it's about how do we build these strong relationships so that we can become these warm demanders, right? Sometimes we have demand that does not have the warmth in it. And so we just expect students to do this and do that, and we challenge them. But when there's no relationship connected to that demand, then all I see you as an adversary, right? If you can build a strong relationship with the student, then those demands that you may have or those high expectations that you will have will be received in a totally different manner because you have put the work in on the front end to be able to get to the point where you can challenge and demand higher from the students. So I think it's definitely going to be work on our end to build that type of structure and that type of connection, but it's definitely possible. Obviously, there's going to be spaces where students will hear a lot of negative things about them, which is why even in the ed talk that I shared, I didn't start off with negative data because I don't want folks to walk away with that as a perception of who Black males are, right? Because we see that all the time. And we have to remember that the kids are watching, so they see that and they hear that. So we have to be mindful with the words that we use, with what we share, because we can be inadvertently putting that inferiority complex within our students just based off what we are sharing and talking about.
Excellent. I'm going to jump to another question that came in a bit ago. While we're with you, Michael, there was a follow-up to talking about the volunteer opportunities. It said, I don't believe Michael indicated whether the volunteer opportunities are during school hours or after school and whether it is virtual with the current pandemic right now.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so right now, obviously, in Minneapolis public schools, we are doing distance learning, so virtual learning. So yes, everything right now is definitely virtual, and it's going on during the school day. So those opportunities to share your stories during the school day. When we are face-to-face, we do have monthly events that our students are able to participate in. And so we definitely have volunteers support and help out with those type of events that we have. But right now, those are not happening.
Gotcha. Let's go to a question that says, with the community unrest and COVID-19, what do you both see as the opportunities or gaps for each of your respective focuses? What should we not lose sight of in these monumental moments? Whoever wants to start.
I can jump in. I think what we can't lose sight of is history. I think it's important for us to step back and look back in. I remember when I first saw on social media, the quote, I saw it on Lissa Jones' Urban Agenda page about how the community was still crying tears from Emmett Till, and as they mourn the murder of George Floyd, Mr. Floyd. So I think this is a time where we're at home, we have an opportunity. I think we really need to reflect upon America's history and look at it very closely. Everything from examining the myth of race. Race is a social construct, and what are the challenges around that? As Mr. Walker's been talking about, the biases. I think we've gotten light in the conversation. We're focusing on biases and microaggressions and the science of bias, how it impacts us. And I think we have to get back to some of the basics. We have to look at discrimination and policies. We have to look at the fact that here we are sitting in Minnesota, and if we look at the 1993 Race Bias Task Force on issues related to criminal justice, things are either the same in 2020 or worse. So I think this is a time for us to step in and step back and look very closely at where we see patterns of open discrimination, where we see patterns of policies being dismantled. I know some folks are like, should I vote or should I not? Have you not read the Shelby case? Do you not see that voting, and I'm not talking about partisanship here, I'm talking about history connecting to the present and the future, that if there's that many impediments related to voting, something would tell me that voting's important. And even if I didn't care about it, maybe I'll watch the movie Good Trouble and look at Congressman John Lewis and his skull being fractured to stand up for us to vote. So for me, I think this is a time to pause, reflect, and grow in some meaningful ways of connecting history to our present and dispelling many of the myths that we have, and stop being in the abstract related to the changes that we know must happen to end discrimination in the workplace, in our communities, wherever we are. So we know that there's work that must be done, and identifying it and spending this time. This is a time, I know Mr. Walker talked about some of the renewal and the health and wellness, but this is the time to get your arsenal ready and figure out what are the best strategies to make sure that we're carrying on this mantle of leadership for generations to come.
And I would echo everything that Dr. Tyner said, and then I would just also add into the conversation about doing, right, our actions. So sometimes we get worried about the big system, and we can just impact what is in our sphere of control. And so if we see things that are happening in our local locus of control, in our immediate space, we need to say something. We need to speak up and address those inequities, those inequalities, whatever we see, and start to challenge and ask those questions so that people start to make different decisions. Because if we don't do those small little things, then the big things will never happen. And so it's important that when we see things happening, we say something and address it right then and there. And so that's what I would just add to that.
Yeah, that's related to the next two questions that have popped up. It took me a little bit, everybody, to understand that people are like thumbs upping these questions. And so that's why they keep jumping up to the top. I get it now, everyone. You want that question answered. I get it. Okay, so related to what you were just talking about, soon to be Dr. Walker, what would you like current and future policymakers and leaders here in Minnesota to know, consider as they work to dismantle systemic racism and the dominance of white supremacy? And then somewhat related, I think, also to what we were just talking about, for both of you possibly, as a white parent of a white elementary school student, how can I highlight Black student achievement and the voices and experiences of her classmates of color with her?
Oh, those are really big questions. Got me moving in my seat, right? Because I don't know if there's like a really succinct answer that you can give for that bigger question around the dominance of white supremacy and systemic racism. So, I mean, really what you want the policymakers to do is to ensure that they're not just making policies that don't really pinpoint what we're talking about. So we have to be mindful that if we just have a policy out there and there's no connection to racial inequalities with that, or it's not directly stated, we will inadvertently have more disparities because that's the way systemic racism works, right? So if you're not being intentional about it, it's not going to really change anything. So we have to be intentional about it. The other piece is, as we're talking about these policies, so we can have all these different policies where what we have to do is change the mindsets and beliefs of folks, because we have this anti-Blackness type rhetoric that is happening. And so I can have the best policies in the world, but if the people who are making the decisions have an anti-Blackness lens, then those policies will be implemented in a way that, again, disproportionately impacts Black and brown folks. And so I think that's one piece. And in order to change those things, we have to look at education as a way to get into those positions, to be at the decision-making table, so that we cannot have that anti-Black rhetoric that is happening in those spaces. And that takes time, but that also means that we have to have more than just one person in those spaces, because now you be the lone person in those spaces. What does it look and feel like for you trying to go up against that system alone?
Anything to add, Dr. Tyner?
I think for me, it's also extremely important to push economics and economic empowerment, because absent of that, it just seems like over all the years of being a civil rights attorney and working in public policy settings, that's a conversation no one wants to have. And isn't it problematic when you can tell me, oh, it could take 300 years to 250 years, depending on which study that you're looking at, to bridge the wealth gap between Blacks and whites. When you look at the wealth gap, for instance, for Black females, it would take me to work all the way until August next year to have pay parity with a white male, and still struggling this year to even get pay parity with a white female. So oftentimes the missing conversation, and we love to quote Dr. King, but we sure never like to talk about the Poor People's Campaign or Operation Breadbasket, when he put economics at the forefront of saying that that would be the future. Because it was one thing, and he described it as, and asking the question, were we integrating into a burning house? When the reality of it is, in many instances, you know, he's saying you can get to the lunch counter, but if I can't buy a burger or coffee, what difference does this make? So I think we have to have a real conversation about the economics. And oftentimes we talk about the symptoms. And I worked as a family law attorney, so we'll say, well, you know, this mother is negligent. No, she's poor. And if poverty is a sign of being negligent and being Black is a sign of being negligent, my mother was the most negligent person on the planet, because she was poor and she was Black and she was a single mother. So I think we're just a little reckless about the policies as it relates to economics, because if my mother had more economic opportunities, I guarantee she would have been able to take on more educational opportunities, other pieces. So I just think that oftentimes we ignore that, and we talk about healthcare disparities, all these other pieces. But when you talk about economics, and I'm not talking about these temporary racial equity relief efforts that are happening right now, I'm talking about long-term that addresses the systemic inequities.
Thank you both. Jumping to another question that came in earlier. Does the OBSA address the taught and learned bias encultured within our children? And now they verbalize about the inherent okayness for white students to get away with breaking the rules. I guess, i.e., it's okay, leave them alone, they're good students, but not students of color. That students of color should be held accountable, but not white students. I think I understand this question. Address the taught and learned bias encultured within our children, that potentially students of color should be held accountable, but not white students. Does that make sense? I think that's a question for you.
I think it makes sense. So I'm gonna answer it how I think I'm hearing it. We don't have to teach them that. They see that every single day with how they are treated when they're walking within our buildings and in our classrooms. So they see straight front and center when somebody gets sent out for the same thing. They get sent out for the same thing somebody else did that's white that does not get sent out. I mean, so we don't have to teach them that. They already come with that information. What we're trying to do is help them understand how to navigate that space, but then also challenge that space. And so one thing you hear us say in the Office of Black Student Achievement is that we are advocates for our Black students. And so the language of teachers is we are the union reps for our Black students. And so they know that when things are not happening correctly, we're going to show up and advocate for and on behalf of our students to ensure that they're getting a fair shake. Because we know that some of those things are happening in schools where they are getting a higher consequence compared to a white student. And we see that in the in the judicial system as well. So it's not like it's just happening in schools, it's happening all over the board. And so we have to be mindful of that. So I hope that's how I heard the question. So hopefully that answers it, whoever asked that question.
All right, we have maybe about 2 minutes left. So I want to get to maybe 2 to 3 more quick questions. I just want to make sure, I know some folks have been waiting. Okay, so there's a little more explanation about the last question. Students of color push back when I hold white students accountable. They actually push back and tell me it's okay, they are good students. So that's a follow-up to that question that you just answered. If you want to jump in and add anything else, Mr. Walker, you can.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure like what answer that they're looking for. So they said that the students of color is defending the white
Yeah, that's what it sounds.
Is that what I'm hearing?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess they're just going back what they've witnessed and shown, like that they always get the benefit of the doubt and I don't deserve that benefit. So they're practicing what they see is happening in the school system. And so now they have internalized that, right? And so we have to be intentional about making sure that no, they deserve what they're getting because they acted in this way. So it's on us to show them something different, is what I think I hear the question is asking.
And Adi, I would just say this is another history moment. Do a little homework related to the Clark test. There's a learned sense of inferiority. It just doesn't start when we come to school. If we're not careful, remember that was a black doll versus a white doll test, which one's pretty, which one's smart. This is something that's so deep. This is something like breathing these racial constructs in America. So I think it's unpacking it again.
Definitely. Okay. As educators, how much time and effort should be dedicated to trying to educate change in the current systems versus creating our own spaces or our own systems? Is it worth it trying to build bridges with the white educators in an education system never meant for Black students or other students of color? Or should our work go towards initiatives outside of the traditional space? I think this is for both of you.
And I have to think about that because I mean, there's always a give and take on any of those things, right? I think Dr. Tyner already talked about it when Dr. King said, have I integrated my people into a burning house, right? So what is going on with that? Has it ever been successful for us within this current system that we're in? I don't want to just say, no, it's not possible, but also can be on the side of folks who saying we should start and do our own thing. So I'm not against that rhetoric either. Sometimes it may be something that we need to do where we're building our foundation of who we are and building that internal self-worth so that when they go into other spaces, they have that foundation of who they are. And so they're more able to navigate the system that they're faced with, this racial system that we have, systemic racism in our society. So I think that's kind of how I'm answering that question.
I would just say I concur with Mr. Walker. I don't think I'm in the position to say it's an either or. And my experience has really been in a both and, because I don't want to put a false dichotomy on this, but I know that we have to have the space to create, to build, and to innovate. And you might have to find that outside of your institution, and you might be the one who creates it.
Excellent, thank you. So second to last question. For both panelists, where do you find the most pushback as change makers? How have you all built coalitions to overcome this pushback and advocate for Black folks?
I don't necessarily know if there's a where you find it the most. I think it's just there. And you know that it's going to be there because whenever you start to stand up for students of color or minoritized students or marginalized students, there will be a pushback that happens and occur. And so you just have to prepare yourself for that, but you still have to speak the truth to power. And so when you start to build coalitions, you got to have those one-on-one conversations with people on a regular basis, quite often, to build up your community that will go to war, go to battle with you. And so now that you're not the only voice, because again, what systems try to do is they try to marginalize voices, right? So if I can just get it to be Walker that's saying that, now I can marginalize him, and then that voice goes away. But if you can create more than just Walker, and you got 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 people, and now it permeates throughout the entire system, then we can really get something changed and some things happening. So I think it's about being intentional about building those coalitions, taking the time to communicate with folks, having conversations, dialogue, the opportunity for pushback between those conversations. So not just walking away and not having that ability to disagree, but really to have those conversations to seek understanding. It's not necessarily about trying to get everybody to agree, but how can we seek understanding so I can understand where you're coming from, and now I can start to maybe see how that can impact and influence our broader system.
And for me, I'll just offer one quick piece of advice that I received early on in doing legislative advocacy and civil rights work from Mr. Nathaniel Kalik, who is the president of the St. Paul chapter of the NAACP. He reminded me on one of the days that I really wanted to give up. Like, no one understands what we're doing. We're pressing too hard, and politically it's not going well for us. He reminded me that I don't have permanent friends. I don't have permanent enemies, but I have permanent interests. And I think if you can keep that at the forefront, and you may be surprised where you find some of those commonalities around interests, but you'll move beyond yourself, and you'll keep yourself focused on a broader mission that touches the lives of others.
That's a great point. I'm going to write that down. Last question, and then also a comment going back to that question about students defending the white students, saying they're good students. The last question is, have either of you read Caste? What stands out for you from that book, if you have?
I have not, so.
No, okay.
I've not.
Not, okay, so maybe that one goes on our reading list.
Mm-hmm.
And the last question was, or the last comment was, maybe they're modeling the grace they wish was also granted to them. It's like that, regarding defending other students.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Oh man, it's 8:12. What do you think? Would you like to answer this? There's one question left. Should we tackle it?
Sure, why not?
So for both panelists, how do you both navigate criticism or anti-Blackness from BIPOC folks? Further, how do you navigate criticism and anti-Blackness from Black people toward the work that you do?
You can go, Dr. Tyner.
That's a good one. I mean, I think it goes back to that advice from Mr. Kalik about my permanent interest. Because if you start taking it personal, you won't be able to build the coalitions that Mr. Walker was talking about. So what I try to do is identify common ground. I'm not going to go into a business meeting knowing that what motivate folks is related to economics. I'm not going to go in there and say, well, let's just end mass incarceration. People go, and it doesn't matter if they're BIPOC or whoever they are, they'll say, well, that wasn't the agenda today. We're talking about P&L, profit and loss. We might be talking about a merger today. So I would go in and say, do you know the average cost of incarceration is about $60,000 per person? You have to be able to relate to your audience. And as far as criticism, a part of what you want to know, and maybe I learned this lesson from reading Dr. Carter G. Woodson's book, The Miseducation of a Negro, you just expect it. I mean, if you're going to do this type of work, the first thing that you have to get past is offense. And what moves past criticism is your ability and the proof of your work. Mr. Walker, you can have any critique that you want, but if you go out in the community, before I even met Mr. Walker, you heard about his work. So he had the proof of it. So I just think continuing to write that proof and continue to write that love letter to the world helps to outshine some of the criticism. But I think, once again, it's as natural as breathing.
Yep, I would
and
just
it's
echo.
by design, Mr. Walker. I don't want to forget that too. I mean, that comes all the way back from slavery, that you have to critique each other because who's working in Master's house, who's not, who's fair skinned, who's this, who's that. And I just even literally, before getting on this call, somebody had a post, they were angry. They said BIPOC didn't include every racial group. It should be Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian. They should be naming everyone. So we'd be fighting all night long.
Yeah, and I would just say that you know, if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, you're going to have people that are criticizing and critiquing what you're doing. And so you're going to make people mad and you're not going to make everybody happy. But as long as what I try to stay focused on and grounded on is I'm being student centered. I'm doing whatever it needs to happen for the support of our Black students. In this talk, I'm talking about Black males, but overall Black students. And so I just stand on that. And as long as I'm standing on that, and I know that I'm speaking from what they have shared with me, then, you know, whatever other folks have to say, that's on them. I'm speaking for that voice.
Thank you both. I want to pass on some commentary that just says, great, from James Burrows. Great job, much needed. You are champions for our Black young people. I always learn something new from each of you. Keep up the great work.
Thank you, Mr. Burrows. I appreciate you, brother.
Thank you.
And with that, we're going to wrap up. So thank you, everyone, for the excellent questions, thought-provoking questions. And thank you once again to Mr. Michael Walker and Dr. Artika Tyner. I so appreciate everything that you shared tonight. I love doing these because I learned so much. I also want to mention, everybody, mark your calendars for the next Ed Talks. That will be on Wednesday, October 21st. You can register to hear Justice Alan Page and Neil Kashkari speak to their proposed amendment to the Minnesota Constitution, guaranteeing quality education for all Minnesota students. You can register online at achieveminneapolis.org/events. And then also keep an eye on your emails. So tonight's recording will be sent out along with some great resources suggested by tonight's presenters, information on future events. Thanks again to our generous funders, Bush Foundation and Comcast. They make Ed Talks possible. So thank you very much to them. And if you'd like to connect with our event co-sponsors, website information can be found on the screen. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And we'll see you at the next Ed Talks.
Peace.